Irvin Studin here, Global Brief Magazine. Let's solve some global problems. Still, the major global problem in the world is the conflict between Russia and the West, or Russia, Ukraine, and the West, as it were. It's a conflict that essentially starts in 2014 with the Ukrainian Revolution, after the Ukrainian Revolution. I'll try to explain how we fix that, but it's become much more complicated still. I did explain some of the genesis of the present misunderstanding between us and the West and all of the former Soviet space, including Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. That will be difficult to remedy in the near future, but I hope we can start. Why is it more complicated? The central conflict in the world is still that between Russia and the West. That one begins in 2014. But it's now overlapped with two other essential conflicts, which really merged in their totality make for devastating potential consequences for the world. The first merger is with the Middle East conflict, which starts in 2003, arguably, with the invasion of Iraq, accelerates through the Arab Spring, certainly the destruction of Libya, civil war in Syria, and they're merged when Russia intervenes in Syria in 2015. Okay? But now it gets more complicated still, because it used to be that the conflict between the United States and China, or maybe the West in quotation marks in China, but essentially the United States and China was completely separate from these two. But arguably when the Trump administration comes to power, they begin to merge. And you might even say that at some point the Middle East conflict and the China-United States conflict will coincide over the course of the next year, at which point we have a devastating conjunction of these three circles, which are conflicts. I would still say the Russia-West conflict remains the nucleus and the one that must be solved essentially if we're to have a chance at any of the others. But it's much more complicated now than it was several years ago. The exit from this conflict must take into account the other two conflicts, but must also stabilize three theaters. It must stabilize Ukraine, which is going into presidential election imminently. It must stabilize Russia, and it must stabilize Europe, the EU, and to some extent the West, but largely the EU. Any algorithm for exit that overstabilizes one at the expense of the other is not stable. And if it understabilizes all of them, we're dead. If the other two conflicts that I mentioned bleed into this conflict, we're dead. If this conflict bleeds into the other one, as it's tending to do, this one becomes increasingly insoluble. So if the window has not closed, and I believe it may have already closed. I've been forwarding this algorithm for a while on the page of Global Brief in our work through 21CQ. Parts of it are on the radar of all the players. Many are actively on the agenda, but the entirety is very difficult to engineer. So we better get our act together in the entire civilized world if we're going to emerge from this without cataclysm. What is the solution to the Ukraine-West Russia conflict? This is Ukraine. I once drew a rectangle called Canada. Today I'm drawing a square called Ukraine. In the context of the Ukrainian Revolution, what essentially happened, without going into morality plays, without getting into diasporic narratives, or without doing accusations vis-a-vis different personae, you had a Ukrainian state that had a glorious population but was very young. This is a young Ukrainian state post-Soviet, less than 25 years before it collapsed during the course of the revolution and the subsequent wars that happened. It was pulled by two fundamental gravities, the European gravity and the Russian gravity, and they were pulling and pulling. And if the general constitution of this state, which was very young and had very little experience of statehood, was not solid, if it did not have the most talented leadership, it would collapse against these forces. And sure enough, in 2014, for reasons that we can discuss in the future, but in some cases are manifest, it collapsed. This was the revolution. The revolution succeeded in radicalizing three parties, three fronts. It radicalized Ukraine within itself. It radicalized us in the West. You'll recall in my last lecture, Russia and the Ukrainian conflict weren't on the radar when Barack Obama was being re-elected in 2012. But all of a sudden, it became the #1 topic very fast. And it radicalized Russia, especially subsequent to the Russian annexation of Crimea. So any algorithm for exit is that much more complicated. It must envelop all three warring theaters, Russia West, the Middle East, and the Asian, the China-Western conflict, and must stabilize these three fronts, starting with a de-radicalization. And soon, because the Ukrainian election is happening, and if there's an internal conflict or any subversion of the politics there, in the context of that election, we are in big trouble in the world. How to do this? Well, the first proposal is a student-led proposal, the introduction of peacekeepers in the southeast of Ukraine. These peacekeepers must be introduced under UN mandate urgently, should have happened 2 or 3 years ago. They must come from a neutral party. What is that neutral party? It cannot be us in the West. We are tendentious, we are belligerents in the conflict. Same with the Russians, same with the post-Soviet space. They are tendentious and belligerents in the conflict. It must come from a different continent. It can't come from NATO. It can't come from the CSTO, the former Soviet bloc, the treaty, the military treaty unifying them. It must come from Asia. And where in Asia? India. India must lead the peacekeeping force. There'll be other countries, but India is the most neutral, most respected country, especially between Russia and Ukraine. All of the top Indian echelons in the past were educated in the Soviet Union. India keeps its powder dry in the conflict and has a great peacekeeping tradition. The import of these peacekeepers is not to solve the conflict globally. It is to solve this micro-conflict and inject a brand new energy into the general dysfunction between these various theaters. Indian peacekeepers come in, they change the creative energy of this conflict. They lead to one, a restabilization package for Ukraine. Restabilization of the country politically and economically. 2, a sanctions package for Russia, if Russia is to be able to play ball and to accept these peacekeepers and to accept a general exit from the solution. 3, some sort of mechanism that allows the EU and Russia to work with and through Ukraine administratively. I call these interstitial ties. 4, some sort of constitutional restructuring of Ukraine, obviously led by Ukraine and its population, for whom I have great sympathy. And it must be a constitution that is legitimate within Ukraine, but allows Ukraine the flexibility to deal within its area. Even if it is a federal constitution, by the way, I speak as a Canadian, a federal constitution, this would seem perfectly appropriate, provided it is one that is completely led by Ukraine. So, constitution of Ukraine. And 5, something about the status of Ukraine militarily in the future. This is a NATO question, this is perhaps a neutrality question. It is led by Ukraine, but with great suggestions by all the other powers. So 5 points, they still remain du jour. They are the only way to go. The peacekeepers are the essential game changer, as it were, that will change the entire energy. It is our last hope.